Hello and welcome to the Backfield, the running back analysis podcast. I'm Big Italy 42. He is Spencer Limbach at Spencer_JL. And obviously, you're the author of this great piece here. And we were talking a little bit before the show about this seems like a perfect week to save yourself some money at the running back position. The first two guys you have mentioned here aren't quite values, but for their recent production and or upside with one guy, definitely still seem like values though.
Yeah, in the first one you got to point out is Matt Forte. Didn't have that great of a performance last week, but you have to consider that was at Seattle. In that spot, no one's really going to have a good game. But now he's priced down a little bit, 8,300 on FanDuel, 7,100 on DraftKings versus Oakland, who was the worst defense allowing fantasy points to running backs last year, and that really hasn't changed much this season. They're giving up an average of 90 yards and one touchdown per game over the first 3 weeks. So you have to really like the situation Matt Forte's in. Jay Cutler will be out for the Bears once again, so you figure they're going to get him the ball in as many ways as they can. And Alshon Jeffrey also will probably be back. He's still nursing a hamstring injury. We don't think he's 100%. Plus, I honestly don't know if Jimmy Clausen can get the ball to him. So expect a lot of dump passes to Forte. That racks up his value on DraftKings. Full point PPR over there, plus 100-yard upside, against this passive Oakland rushing defense.
Yeah, he even has a 100-yard receiving upside in an ideal scenario here where, like you mentioned, Clausen just not going to be able to get the ball down the field. And Forte, he was still the focal point last week, but he ran well against Seattle, which was fairly surprising because that defense was just in a great spot. But I think Forte is going to be a guy that, like you mentioned, going to be really much lower owned than he probably should be, considering he actually has a really good matchup this week.
Yep.
Next guy you mentioned is on the other side of that game, Latavius Murray against the Bears, who have been a terrible run defense this season. They've been a terrible everything this season. 6,300 on DraftKings, 75 on FanDuel. Starting to creep up above the value threshold, but the guy's getting a ton of touches over the past couple weeks. He's even been targeted a couple times in the passing game. And, this offense, all of a sudden, after looking terrible in week one, looks like a really potent attack. With Murray, you got the passing game, so no one's going to be keying on stopping Murray because Derek Carr and Amari Cooper are looking pretty terrifying on the in the passing game as well.
Yeah, and just the fact on volume alone, you have to look at him. He's getting all the goal line carries, and good news for him, the Raiders are actually moving the ball into the red zone. So, he's making good on those as well. So, you have to consider Chicago one of the worst rushing defenses in the league right now, one of the worst defenses overall. And really, I'm not sure about game flow in this game. Oakland is now favored by 3. So basically a pick 'em, even though it's at Chicago. But both of these backs, Murray and Forte, I'm not sure how dependent on game flow they are. Yes, that would generate some upside if their team was winning down the stretch. But, both of these guys are really involved, whether it's a close game, whether they're coming from behind, or, whether they're winning. So I think they're both in a pretty good spot. It just comes down to price for me. And I think Forte might be a little bit safer just because he's more the proven commodity. But, they're both in pretty good spots here, and Murray's a little bit cheaper.
Yeah, I like that. And then the value play of the week, it looks like LaShawn McCoy. I don't think it's official, but he's probably going to sit out. I don't know what would have to change for him to play in this one, but looks very unlikely. Carlos Williams, especially on DraftKings at 3,400, 63 on FanDuel. The Giants' defense looks like it's been very good against the run as far as yards per game. But when you take into account the fact that they've just been absolutely destroyed through the air, it seems more like a situation of, the Browns a couple of years ago looked like they had a great pass defense, but in all reality, they just got gashed on the ground so much that why throw the ball if you don't have to? So I'm not one of those people who's shying away from Carlos Williams in this matchup just based on those numbers alone.
Yeah, and I hope that people do, actually. If they look at the first 3 games, which is too small of a sample size for us to draw conclusions, and especially considering that this defense last year, 4.9 yards per carry was what they allowed, worst in the NFL. So, what has really changed up front for them to be this much better? Nothing. Yeah. So I'm expecting them to regress as the season goes along on that defensive front. And, there should be a lot of rushing attempts here for Carlos Williams. And this Buffalo offense has been pretty surprising as well. Kind of as we were saying with Oakland earlier, that they are moving the ball down the field. They are sustaining drives. And Carlos Williams was getting goal line carries with LaShawn McCoy in there. And, now McCoy's out, so he's going to get those carries. Plus all the intermediate carries should get up to, 20 attempts maybe in this matchup. And it's a pretty decent one. So 3,400 near minimum salary on DraftKings, 6,300 on FanDuel. I think he's a great RB2 on both sites, and he will be likely popular. I have him listed as, 35, 45, maybe 50% in cash games on either site. So, I already see a lot of love for him, and LaShawn McCoy is not necessarily ruled out, even though Rex Ryan did say today, as that is Wednesday, that it doesn't look good. And anytime a coach says that this early in the week, he's probably more doubtful than anything.
Yeah, absolutely. And why take the risk when a guy like Carlos Williams has looked great in the running game anyway? Might as well let McCoy rest up. Next up, the flavor of the week, Devonta Freeman for the Falcons had that huge performance last week. And like you mentioned here, certainly not expecting a breakout performance like that, which is one unlike any performance he's ever had before. But at his current price tag and his current role in this offense, especially on DraftKings where he catches a lot of passes and he's good in space, that he's a guy that certainly has a significant upside at this price tag still.
And really most of his fantasy value is kind of predicated on garbage. And by that I don't mean garbage time necessarily, but just eating up those touchdowns where Matt Ryan, Julio Jones, work the ball down the field in between the 20s, and then that defense gets tired, and then all of a sudden they run Freeman up the middle for a 5-yard touchdown. I mean, he could do that a couple of times again this week, even though this Houston run defense is pretty good with J.J. Watt and Vince Wilfork up front there. Not expecting Freeman to have a ton of yardage, like he eclipsed the 100-yard mark last week, so that limits some of his upside, but still the PPR and the scoring touchdown upside definitely keeps his fantasy appeal alive, especially on DraftKings for 5,200, and you can roster 3 running backs over there with that flex spot. So that's probably where I'm keying on him most. Just kind of depending where lineup configuration takes me from there.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. And then the next guy is a guy who has been integrated into the offense. He's got a decent amount of touches so far. Last week, game flow kind of took him out because the Chargers were getting smashed. But Browns are allowing more rushing yards per game than any other defense in the NFL. And that should be no surprise because they were a bottom feeder last year against the run as well. Melvin Gordon, as we know, a very talented runner. This isn't just a guy that you're plugging and playing, hoping for a breakout. This is a guy that's going to break out, and he's going to be a key part of this offense. And, if you have him on the week where he has his big performance, which, I imagine is going to happen very soon, especially in this matchup, this is a great spot to target Melvin Gordon, especially where people are off him a little bit because of the dud that he threw up last week.
Yeah, and I also mentioned that in my article that a breakout game is on the horizon one of these weeks, but as you said, he's fell victim to game flow last week, had a tough matchup against the Bengals in week 2, but his role is increasing with this offense. They like to run him. They're leaning on him a little more as every week goes along, and this is one of the worst rush defenses in the league, so it all kind of lines up that this could be the game where we see Melvin Gordon go for 100-plus yards and a touchdown or 2. Obviously, there's a little bit concerned because Danny Woodhead has been siphoning off some carries in the past, especially down towards the red zone. So that worries you a little bit, but, the upside's still there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I like that call a lot. Frank Gore finally had his good performance last week. He's a guy who looked fine in the first few weeks. He ran the ball well, had a goal line fumble. We mentioned him last week as a guy that, was in line for a bounce back, and he certainly did that this past week with a couple touchdowns. Still only $4,700 on DraftKings, $73 on FanDuel. This is becoming a more balanced offense for the Colts, which isn't something that we saw, especially last season. It was a volume passing attack, but at this price tag, though, this is a guy that should still see, upwards of 20 carries, and it's certainly still getting all the goal line looks for the Colts. So he certainly has that upside for him as well.
Yeah, and the Jaguars, the game flow should be in his favor here. Indianapolis favored by 9. And And kind of the theme that we're seeing is that, DraftKings is a lot softer pricing this week than FanDuel. I mean, that's kind of been the theme over the past few weeks, in my opinion. So Frank Gore is 7,300 on FanDuel, 4,700 on DraftKings. Obviously, more of a target over there on DraftKings. And, he had 22 fantasy points last week against Tennessee, a pretty bad rushing defense. Jacksonville, even though, they're ranked a little bit higher in the yards per carry allowed, but 27th overall in opponent run, given up to opposing running backs. So I really like Frank Gore this week, but Indianapolis checks in as one of the top scoring teams of the week, and he's still cheap over there on DraftKings.
Yeah, absolutely. So take advantage of that while you can. Another guy who's similarly priced, but you already mentioned him earlier in the Melvin Gordon write-up, is that's Danny Woodhead, a guy who, as you mentioned here, looks like he's in a great spot for GPPs because he was extremely productive the first 2 weeks, kind of got shut out last week, and a lot of that not really his fault because it was just a great performance by the Vikings and a terrible performance by every non-Keenan Allen San Diego Chargers. So Danny Woodhead in a phenomenal matchup also against Cleveland is a really sneaky GPP play.
Yeah, and I had Danny Woodhead in my DraftKings lineup last week, and he still got like 13 fantasy points, just because that full point PPR. And he had 5+ receptions in 2 of the first 3 games this season. And so, I mean, that's basically like getting a touchdown just on pass catches. And, he has that same matchup that Melvin Gordon has against Cleveland, one of the worst rushing defenses in the league. San Diego's favored by 8. I think there's enough production to be had by both of them in this game. Where the scales are going to tip between Gordon and Woodhead, we don't really know. That's why they're both listed as GPP plays here. But I think that's a calculated risk to take just on matchup alone.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a guy that we've seen. I mean, he's got 2 touchdown upside easily. So your last one here is going to be a really incredible GPP play. If you take a chance on him, it seems like we might not know Marshawn Lynch's status until Monday night. Listed as 50-50 last I saw today, but Thomas Rawls was a guy who had a huge game last week, 16 for 104 against the Bears. And, Detroit is not anywhere near the defense that they were last year. They added Haloti Ngata, but this is a defense that just doesn't look good. And this is an undrafted rookie that just kind of came out of nowhere. So for Seattle in a game that they should win, I mean, maybe they exercise some caution with Lynch this week after letting him play last week when he wasn't 100%.
Yeah, I'm guessing that might be the case where Lynch just gets maybe 10 carries or so, and then kind of see how game flow works out if Seattle builds a reasonable lead, which they probably should, just looking at the way Detroit's been playing, and now they're on the road at Seattle. So I'm guessing a lot of people won't take that chance just because there are a lot of great value plays. Like we said, Carlos Williams is probably the de facto top value play of this running back group this week. And, he's basically the same price as Rawls on both sites. So guessing people will gravitate that way. If something happens to Williams, or, say, even if you play both of them and just, pay up at every other position, that can work out in your favor. If you're looking at this article, the run defense ranks for Detroit. Some of that is predicated on last season's totals. And without Ndamukong Suh down in there, the Lions rank 20th, allowing 112 rushing yards per game so far this season. So definitely a lot softer up front this time around. And, I kind of like Rawls for that reason. And, if he gets 15 to 20 carries, he can definitely pile up the fantasy points. And for minimum salary on DraftKings, I think that's, at least worth GPP consideration.
Yeah, it seems like he's certainly worth the roll of the dice. And like you said on DraftKings, you can always slot in a different 3K men's salary guy for the Monday night game because obviously none of them are going to come without risk anyway. So definitely on DraftKings. But, if you get him at low ownership on FanDuel, roll the dice with him there, and it ends up paying off, that could be a nice way to set yourself apart in some GPPs, definitely. Yep. And that's going to wrap things up for this week. Find us on Twitter at DF Cafe. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, and check out the rest of our great content at dailyfantasycafe.com.